I Married a Man Who Was Legally Dead by Joan Savage. Chapter 1. The Carpenter. The first thing Emily Carter noticed about him was his hands. She was standing in the ruins of the library's reading room, watching rain pour through the gap where the ceiling used to be, when he walked through the front door carrying a toolbox and wearing an expression so calm it was almost unsettling. A winter storm had torn through Harrow Cove the night before, ripping a section of roof clean off the east wing and flooding 3 rows of irreplaceable Pacific Northwest history. Emily had spent the morning in rubber boots, pulling waterlogged books off shelves and trying not to cry. He set his toolbox down on the dry side of the floor and looked up at the damage with steady eyes. "That's a significant breach," he said. "I noticed," Emily said. He looked at her then. He had dark eyes, not black, but a deep, serious brown, the kind that belonged to a man who had seen more than he talked about. Brown. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days, and a quiet manner that felt less like shyness and more like deliberate restraint. "Noah Reed," he said, extending one of those large, work-worn hands. She shook it. "Emily Carter, head librarian, the person who called 3 contractors this morning, and you were the only one who answered. Most people in this town know better than to be out after a storm like that. Are you saying I should have waited?" He looked up at the ceiling again, measuring something with his eyes that she couldn't read. "No," he said. "I'm saying you were right to call." He got to work immediately. No small talk, no complaints about the weather or the scope of the job. He moved through the damaged room with a quiet efficiency that Emily found strangely comforting after a morning of pure chaos. By noon, he had tarped the breach, assessed the structural damage, and produced a handwritten estimate on a piece of paper he pulled from his shirt pocket. The number was fair. Fairer than she expected. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "I don't quote numbers I'm not sure about," he said. She hired him on the spot. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. For 3 weeks, Noah Reed became a fixture in her library, arriving early, leaving late, rebuilding the east wing beam by beam with a patience and precision that made Emily stop sometimes, pretending to reorganize a shelf nearby, just to watch him work. She told herself she was monitoring the progress of the repairs. She was not entirely honest with herself. Chapter 2. A Quiet Beginning. By the time the east wing was restored, Emily knew 3 things about Noah Reed. First, he was extraordinarily good at his work. The rebuilt ceiling was better than the original. She had run her hand along the new beams and felt the clean, deliberate care in every joint and surface. The man did not cut corners. Second, he had been in Harrow Cove for approximately 6 years, long enough that most people considered him a local, but short enough that everyone still had slightly different accounts of where he had come from. She had heard Washington State, somewhere up north, some coastal town she couldn't place. Nobody seemed entirely sure. Third, he did not talk about his past. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't evasion exactly. It was more like a door that was always present but never opened. Questions about his family produced polite deflections. Questions about his life before Harrow Cove produced short, pleasant redirections toward the present. He was not rude about it. He was, in fact, one of the warmest people she had met in a town that wasn't short on warmth. He remembered that she took her coffee black. He brought a second cup one Thursday morning without being asked. He noticed when the library's front step was loose and fixed it on his lunch break without mentioning it to her at all. She only realized it when she nearly tripped and caught herself on the railing, looked down, and found fresh nails in solid wood. You fixed the step, she said. He was loading tools into his truck. He glanced back. It was a liability. I didn't ask you to. I know. She stood there a moment. Thank you, Noah. He nodded once, the way he nodded at everything she thanked him for. Like gratitude made him slightly uncomfortable, and he received it as quickly as possible to move past the moment. She filed that away. It was one more small piece of a man who was, she was beginning to realize, assembled entirely from small pieces that did not quite add up to a complete picture. Her best friend and the town's most dedicated gossip, Mara Hollins, had opinions. And the town's most... He's mysterious, Mara announced over wine on a Friday evening at Emily's kitchen table. You know what mysterious means? It means he's a private person. It means there's a story. Everyone in this town has a boring story. Noah Reed has an interesting one. Mara pointed her glass in Emily's direction. And you are interested. I am interested in having my library roof repaired correctly. The roof has been repaired for 2 weeks. He's still there every day doing finish work. There's a lot of finish work. Mara gave her a long look. Emily, you have been single for 2 years. You have turned down 4 perfectly nice men and 1 mildly irritating but very wealthy one. You have been telling everyone, including your mother, that you are completely content with your independence and your books. I am. Then why are you smiling right now? Emily pressed her lips together. I'm not smiling. You were absolutely smiling. I'm not smiling. Mara stood, collected her wine, and kissed Emily on the top of the head as she passed. I'm going home. Just think about it. Emily thought about it. She thought about it for approximately 6 more days before she finally, casually, during a Thursday afternoon when the library was quiet and the winter light was turning everything amber, asked Noah Reed if he would like to have dinner sometime. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she started to regret it. Then he said, Yes, I'd like that. Simple as that. Chapter 3. Falling in Love. They went to the Anchor House, which was the best restaurant in Harrow Cove, which was not saying an enormous amount, but which had excellent clam chowder and a window table that looked out over the harbor. They talked for 3 hours, and a window table that looked... Emily learned that Noah had grown up near water, that he had learned carpentry from a man he described only as someone who believed in doing things right the first time, and that he had an unexpected and extremely dry sense of humor that crept up on her sideways and made her laugh before she saw it coming. He learned that she had moved to Harrow Cove 4 years ago after a relationship that she described as a sincere attempt at the wrong thing, that she had grown up in Portland and still missed good Thai food, and that she had read approximately 11,000 books in her life and could not stop and had no intention of trying. Do you have a favorite? He asked. That's like asking me to choose a favorite breath of air. Narrow it down. She thought about it seriously. Rebecca, by Daphne du Maurier. A woman falls in love with a man who is hiding something enormous about his past. The whole story is about whether love can survive the weight of secrets. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't fully read. Does it? He asked. Survive? Read it and find out. He smiled. It was a real one, not the polite kind he deployed during professional conversations. It changed his whole face, softened the jaw, lit up the serious eyes, made him look for a moment like a younger, less guarded version of himself. She filed that away too. Over the next 4 months, they fell into each other the way that feels, afterward, like inevitability. Slow Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, long walks on the beach south of the lighthouse where the sand was dark and the wind came off the water hard enough to make conversation an effort. She visited his workshop once, a clean, organized space behind a rented property on the edge of town that smelled of cedar and sawdust, and stood in the doorway looking at the half-finished furniture arranged across the floor like a small civilization, every piece of it built with the same quiet deliberateness he brought to everything. He drove her home after a storm knocked out power to the whole peninsula, and found her candles and made dinner from whatever was in her refrigerator and sat across from her in the candlelight, talking until midnight. He pulled her against him on the beach during a particularly brutal January gale and held on, and the combination of the cold and the wind and the solid warmth of him was so precisely right that she stopped overthinking everything for the first time in 2 years. She knew she was falling in love with him because it frightened her. Her ex, Daniel, had not frightened her at all. She had slipped into that relationship the way you slip into warm water, comfortable, easy, and ultimately going nowhere. Noah was different. Noah mattered in a way she hadn't planned for, and the fact that there were still doors in him she hadn't been through made that mattering feel precarious. "Can I ask you something?" she said one evening. They were sitting on her porch in the last of February's weak sunlight, and he had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder. "Yes." "Why don't you ever talk about your family?" The arm around her shoulders didn't tense exactly, but she felt something shift, a stillness that replaced the ease. "It's complicated," he said. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said. "I'm not asking for everything. I'm just asking if there's something I should know." He was quiet for a long time. The harbor was visible from her porch if you tilted your head right, a thin silver line between the rooftops. "There are things in my past," he said finally, "that I haven't fully resolved. Things I was waiting to have sorted out before I—" He stopped, started again. "I don't want to bring you into something unfinished." "Noah, I'm already in." He looked at her then with an expression that was equal parts relief and something darker, something she would later identify, with retrospect's terrible clarity, as guilt. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you are." He kissed her temple. She let it go for that night. She would not let it go forever. But she gave him that night. 3 months later, standing in a garden full of late May wildflowers with Mara openly weeping in the front row, and the smell of the ocean on everything, Emily Carter said yes. Chapter 4. The wedding. The ceremony was small, the way both of them wanted it. 12 people, the Reverend Thomas Abbott, who had married half of Harrow Cove over 40 years and never seemed to tire of it, who had married half of Mara as maid of honor, vibrating with barely contained joy. Old Gerald Marsh from the hardware store, who had known Noah longer than almost anyone in town, sitting in the second row with his big hands folded and a rare smile on his weathered face. Emily wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a cream dress she had found in a shop in Portland, and her hair loose the way Noah had once mentioned, quietly, that he liked it. She carried white wildflowers because she preferred them to roses. Noah wore a dark suit that fit him like he'd owned it forever, though Mara had quietly confided to Emily that she'd seen the receipt from the tailor in Coos Bay, and he'd had it made for the occasion. He stood at the end of the aisle with his hands at his sides and watched Emily walk toward him with an expression so open and unguarded that it made her chest hurt with tenderness. This man who kept everything private had let her see him, fully, without armor, for the first time. Reverend Abbott read from Corinthians, as Reverend Abbotts do. Noah held both of her hands through the entire ceremony, his grip warm and steady. "Noah David Reed," Reverend Abbott said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Something flickered across Noah's face at the sound of his full name. Fast, gone almost immediately, the way a shadow moves when a cloud crosses the sun. Emily saw it because she was looking directly at him. She filed it away. Later, she would take it out and look at it differently. "I do," he said. His voice was completely steady. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Oregon," Reverend Abbott said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed while Mara made a sound that was either laughing or crying, or some previously undocumented combination of both, laughing or crying. The dinner afterward was at the Anchor House, the same restaurant where they'd had their first date, because Emily thought that was romantic, and Noah had agreed without being sentimental about it. The clam chowder was excellent. Gerald Marsh made a toast that was 3 sentences long and completely sincere, and better than any of the long ones Emily had ever sat through at other weddings. Mara's toast was 12 minutes long and extraordinarily entertaining. Noah leaned over and murmured in Emily's ear, "Your friend is remarkable." "She's a hurricane in human clothing," Emily whispered back. He laughed, that real full laugh she had been collecting for a year. She tucked it away with all the rest. They drove home along the coast road with the windows down, despite the chill, because the night air smelled like salt and pine, and Emily wanted to remember it exactly. Night air smelled like salt. Noah had one hand on the wheel and one hand in hers on the center console, and the lighthouse at Harrow Point swept its beam across the road every 30 seconds in a slow, reliable rhythm, and Emily Carter thought, "I chose right. I finally chose right." She had no idea that in 11 days, that certainty would crack open at the foundation. Chapter 5. The Dead Man. It started with a form. Emily had been updating the library's collection database, a project she had been putting off since autumn, when she decided to simultaneously tackle the pile of miscellaneous paperwork that had accumulated on her desk. Most of it was mundane: vendor invoices, insurance renewal notices, a certified letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago for the building's listed owner of record, which was technically a property trust connected to the County Historical Society, and which she had set aside meaning to forward it. She opened it now, intending to note the address and redirect it. It wasn't addressed to her or to the library. It was addressed to a Noah David Reed, care of the Harrow Cove Public Library, which was strange, and it was from the Oregon Department of Justice, which made her sit up. She almost set it back down. It was not her mail. Then she saw that it had been opened. Months ago, from the look of the fold marks, and then resealed imprecisely. Someone had read this letter. She read it. The letter was a notice of record discrepancy, formal language, bureaucratic, and dense. It referred to a matter of identity documentation and stated that records on file with the Oregon Vital Records Office, in conjunction with federal records held by the Department of Homeland Security, indicated a conflict regarding the individual identified as Noah David Reed, date of birth listed as the 7th of March, and Social Security number partially redacted for security. The conflict, the letter stated, was as follows: for security. According to state and federal records, Noah David Reed had been declared legally dead on September 19th, 5 years prior to the current date. Emily read the sentence 3 times. She set the letter down. She picked it up. She read it again. There had to be an error. There were often errors in government records. It was a bureaucratic mistake, a case of crossed files, 2 people sharing a name. She had read enough news stories about Social Security Administration disasters to know it happened. People received letters declaring them dead all the time, and it took years to sort out. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her bag. She went home and made dinner and said nothing to Noah about it, because it was obviously a mistake, and she was not going to alarm him over a clerical error. But that night, after he fell asleep, she got her laptop. She started with public record searches, the basic kind available to anyone. property records, Oregon court filings, and available to anyone. She searched Noah David Reed, Oregon. What she found made her close the laptop, sit in the dark kitchen for 11 minutes, and then open it again. There was a death record, filed in Coos County, 5 years ago. Noah David Reed, age 34, declared legally dead following an investigation into a boating accident on the Coos Bay estuary in which a vessel registered to a Noah. David Reed was found partially submerged with evidence of having taken on water rapidly. No body recovered. Investigation lasting 14 months. Declared dead in absentia per Oregon statute. The man in her bedroom was 39 years old. The math matched. She sat there until 2 a.m. with the laptop open and her husband asleep down the hall. When she finally went to bed, she lay in the dark and listened to him breathe and tried to remember if she had ever really known anyone at all. Chapter 6. Secrets from the Past. She did not confront him immediately. Secrets from the past. This was, she would later explain to Mara, not cowardice. It was a conscious decision to gather information before reacting, because she was a librarian, and librarians did not draw conclusions from a single source. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she decided what it meant. Over the following 4 days, she learned the following things. The boat that had been found partially submerged in the Coos Bay estuary 5 years ago was registered to a man named Marcus Alden Webb, not Noah Reed. The name change in the records was the first anomaly she flagged. The death record was filed under Noah David Reed, but the vessel registration and the original incident report named Marcus Webb. She found the discrepancy buried in a public court document, a civil case that had been filed and dismissed relating to the estate of the deceased. Marcus Webb had had a life. She found pieces of it, a contractor's license issued in Tillamook County 12 years ago. A business registration, a property purchase in a small coastal community north of Coos Bay. And then, 5 years ago, everything stopped. The business went dormant. The property was eventually sold through a probate proceeding. Marcus Webb ceased to exist. 6 months later, in county contractor licensing records, a Noah David Reed appeared. Licensed carpenter, Harrow Cove, Oregon. She sat with this for a long time, then she drove to Gerald Marsh's hardware store. Gerald was 71, had lived in Harrow Cove his entire life, and operated on the theory that people asked questions for reasons that were their own business. He listened to Emily without interrupting, which was not something everyone was capable of doing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He straightened a display of caulk tubes that didn't need straightening. "I've known him since he came to town," Gerald said finally. And I knew there was something." Gerald looked at her directly. "And I knew there was not something bad, Emily. I want to be clear about that. I've known bad men. Noah Reed is not a bad man. Whatever name he came here with, he is not a bad man. That's not..." She stopped, breathed. "That's not actually the point, Gerald." "I know." He set down the caulk tube. "He never told me specifics. He did say once, and this was probably 3 years ago, over a beer after closing, that he'd left a situation that could have gotten him killed. He said it simply, like a fact. And then he said he was grateful to be in Harrow Cove, and he never mentioned it again." Emily drove home in the gray afternoon light with the heater on and her hands tight on the wheel. That evening, Noah made pasta because it was his turn to cook, and he had become invested, over the past year, in learning to do it properly. He put fresh herbs on the table and poured her a glass of wine, and they sat in the kitchen that smelled like garlic and the sea, and he talked about a commission he'd gotten from a bed and breakfast in Florence, a set of custom bookshelves, and she sat across from him and watched this man she loved, and thought about how a person could be completely themselves and still be, in some fundamental way, a stranger. She waited until dinner was finished. "I need to talk to you," she said. He looked at her, and something in her voice or her face must have told him, because the ease drained out of his expression and was replaced by a stillness so complete it was almost frightening. "Okay," he said. She put the letter on the table between them. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. After a moment, he closed his eyes. "Noah," she said. "Or should I call you something else?" The silence stretched. "My name," he said quietly, "was Marcus." Chapter 7. The Truth Behind the Records. He talked for 3 hours. Later, Emily would think about how long he had been holding it, carrying the whole weight of it alone for 5 years, and what it must have felt like to finally set it down. He talked quietly, without drama, the way he did everything, and she sat across from him and listened and did not interrupt. Marcus Webb had been a contractor, a good one. He had built a successful small business on the Oregon coast, done honest work, made a modest life. He had also, without fully understanding what he was stepping into, taken a job 7 years ago, remodeling a commercial property in Coos Bay that turned out to belong to a man named Dennis Carell. Dennis Carell, as Marcus discovered when federal investigators showed up at his workshop one Tuesday morning, was under active investigation for money laundering, construction fraud, and connections to an organized crime network operating up and down the Pacific coast. They wanted me to testify, Noah, Marcus said. He was looking at his hands on the table, turned palm up, the way people look at their hands when they're trying to understand how they got where they are. "I had documentation. I had invoices, communications, site records that showed they were using legitimate construction projects to move money. I didn't know what I had until they explained it to me." Emily was very still. "Witness protection," she said. "A version of it, more of an emergency relocation while the case was built. They moved me up the coast, gave me paperwork. The plan was that I would testify, Carell and his people would be convicted, and after sentencing, I could resume my life." He paused. "What they didn't account for was that Carell's people found out I was cooperating before the case went to trial. There was a leak somewhere. I was on a boat, my own boat, a small fishing vessel I used on weekends, and someone interfered with it. I got off. The boat didn't. I used on weekends." Emily made herself breathe. "They tried to kill you." "The boat started taking on water 2 miles out. I made it to shore. The investigators found the boat and concluded initially that I had gone down with it." He looked up at her then, and the exhaustion and the relief and the grief of it were all there at once on his face. "It took them 3 days to find me. By that time, the story was already out. Carell's lawyers got hold of it. They published it, that Marcus Webb was dead, that their client had been pursued by a cooperating witness who had now conveniently died at sea. The case started to collapse. "So they declared you dead to protect you," Emily said. "It was more complicated than that. The investigators wanted to keep me alive and usable. The bureaucracy wanted the file closed. There was a mistake, a real mistake, a genuine clerical disaster. And somewhere in the shuffle of moving me and changing my documentation, a death record was filed under the wrong identity. My new identity." He spread his hands. "Noah Reed died on paper while Marcus Webb simply disappeared, and I was left in the middle. A man with a name that legally belonged to a dead person and a real name that belonged to a closed investigation. Why didn't you fix it? 5 years, Noah. Why didn't you?" "Because the case never fully closed." His voice was level, but she could hear the weight under it. "Carell was convicted on reduced charges. People in his organization are still active. For 3 years, the investigators told me to stay quiet, stay invisible, let the remaining cases work through the courts. And by the time it was theoretically safer, by the time I might have been able to come forward and address the legal situation, I had built a life here. I was Noah. I was someone I actually recognized. He looked at her with the most honest eyes she had ever seen on any person. And then I met you, and I should have told you before the wedding. I know that. I knew it then. Told you before the wedding. I kept telling myself I would have it sorted, that I would have the legal situation addressed before it ever became something you had to deal with. And then we got married. Then we got married, he said quietly. And I am sorry, Emily. I am genuinely sorry. There is no version of this where I handled it correctly, and I know that. Emily sat with it. She sat with all of it, the truth and the fear and the love and the betrayal, and tried to find where the edges were. Is there danger? She said finally. Right now, are we in danger? He was silent for one long second. I received a message 3 weeks ago, he said. That's why the letter ended up at the library. Someone was using that address because they knew about us, and they wanted to be sure I saw it. It wasn't from the government. It was from someone in Carell's network. Emily felt the cold move through her before she fully understood what she was feeling. What kind of message? She said. A warning, he said. She said, that they know I'm alive. Chapter 8. The life he lost. She did not leave. This surprised her afterward, because there had been a version of herself, the version from 2 years ago, the careful, twice-burned, thoroughly self-protective woman who had arrived in Harrow Cove specifically to avoid complications, who absolutely would have left. That woman had made a policy of this. Distance was safety. Safety was peace. Peace was enough. But she was not that woman entirely anymore. She left the kitchen and went and sat on the porch in the dark for 45 minutes, and when Noah came and stood in the doorway without speaking, she said, I'm not leaving. I need you to understand that I'm angry and I'm scared and I have a significant amount to process, but I'm not leaving. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came and sat beside her. They sat there in the dark together and listened to the ocean. Tell me about Marcus, she said. Tell me who you were before. Tell me about Marcus. He talked about it quietly, haltingly, the way people talk about places they were happy that they cannot go back to. He had grown up inland, contrary to what people assumed from his ease around water. Medford, Oregon, the Green Valley south of the Cascades. His father had been a builder. His mother had taught 4th grade. He had one sister. Had, past tense, because she believed him dead, and the thought of that sat in the space between them like something neither of them knew what to do with. What's her name? Claire. He said it the way you say a word you haven't let yourself say for a long time. She still thinks you're dead. Yes. Emily absorbed this. And your parents? My father passed 8 years ago. Heart attack. My mother is in Medford still. He stopped. She thinks I'm dead. Emily pressed her hand flat against her sternum because there was a specific pain there that needed something to push back against. Noah, your mother thinks her son is dead. I know. Your mother thinks for 5 years. Emily? His voice was barely there. I know. She turned to look at him and saw, for the first time since she had known him, that his eyes were wet. He wasn't crying. This was not a man who cried easily or often. She had already understood that about him. But he was close to it, and the fact that he was close to it, that this was what broke through the surface after everything else, told her something important about who he was underneath all the quiet. "Okay," she said. "Okay, then here's what we're going to do." He looked at her. "We're going to call a lawyer," she said, "and we're going to fix this. The legal situation, the records, all of it. And then you are going to call your mother." "It's not that simple. The threat—" "I know about the threat." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am not dismissing the threat. But I am also not living the rest of my life married to a dead man. That is not the life I signed up for, Noah. You are going to become legally alive again. And we are going to do it together." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Then she recognized it. It was what relief looked like on someone who had stopped expecting it. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "I'm furious with you," she said. "But yes, also that." She reached out and took his hand in the dark. In the morning, she started making calls. Chapter 9. Fighting for his name. The lawyer's name was Patricia Osei, and she practiced federal civil and identity law out of an office in Portland that looked like a hurricane had hit it, but that was, Emily quickly realized, organized according to a system of complete internal logic. Patricia listened to the entire situation in one sitting, asked 12 precise and unemotional questions, and then sat back in her chair and said, "This is genuinely one of the more interesting cases I've seen in 15 years. The good news is that this is solvable. The not great news is that it involves a minimum of 4 separate agencies and will require establishing a documented chain of evidence regarding your original identity, the circumstances of the relocation, and the nature of the erroneous death filing." "How long?" Emily asked. "Realistically, 4 to 6 months for the legal resolution. The criminal threat element is a separate matter." Patricia looked at Noah. "I am going to refer you to someone who deals specifically with situations where protected cooperating witnesses have been compromised. They will want to talk to you in detail." "Will he be safe?" Emily asked. Patricia looked at her steadily. "I won't make promises I can't guarantee. But there are people who handle exactly this, and the fact that you are coming forward now, rather than continuing to hide, is strategically your strongest position. Continued invisibility has not served you well." She looked back at Noah. "Hiding makes you a target. Making yourself legally real makes you considerably more difficult to threaten." Noah looked at Emily. She looked back at him. "Let's do it," he said. The months that followed were not easy. There were federal interviews conducted in a conference room in a federal building in Portland, where Noah sat across from 2 investigators and a woman from the U.S. Marshals Service and went through the entire story from the beginning. Emily was not permitted in the room. She sat in a waiting area with bad coffee and a view of the parking garage and read the same page of a novel 4 times without retaining a word. When he came out, 3.5 hours later, she stood up. He looked wrung out, but he was standing straight. "They have enough," he said. "The remaining open cases against Carell's network. They have enough to move, which means they no longer have a reason to keep the Marcus Webb matter unresolved." "And the threat?" "They're addressing it, unresolved." He left it at that, and she let him, understanding that some things were not going to be fully explained, and choosing to trust the officials who had told her, in a separate brief conversation she had requested through Patricia, that the specific individual responsible for the threatening message had been identified and that steps were being taken. She trusted it, partially because she had no alternative, and partially because she was choosing, deliberately and consciously, to stop organizing her life around anticipated catastrophe. The records process was its own war. Patricia filed motions in the Oregon Vital Records Court and the Federal District Court simultaneously. There were delays, because there are always delays, and moments when a clerk in one office was waiting for a document from another office that was waiting for a confirmation from a third office, and Emily developed a profound, personal, entirely new sympathy for every person she had ever encountered who was trying to correct a bureaucratic error about themselves. In the 4th month, when it was March again and the first signs of actual spring were visible on the headlands above Harrow Cove, Patricia called. "The federal motion is through," she said. "The death record for Noah David Reed has been officially vacated and expunged. The supporting documentation establishing his identity as Marcus David Webb, your husband's legal identity prior to relocation, has been accepted and certified. Your husband's legal identity. We are approximately 3 to 5 weeks from the Oregon State Court confirming the name and identity reconciliation, at which point your husband will be, in the eyes of the law, alive and himself, and able to resume or establish whatever legal identity he chooses going forward." Emily sat down on the library steps in the March sunshine. "He can use either name?" "Legally, both identities are reconciled. He can file to maintain Noah Reed as a legal name or revert entirely to Marcus Webb, or some combination. That's a subsequent filing. The important thing right now is that he exists. He is a real person with a verified, documented identity. Nobody can claim otherwise." Emily thought about all the ways a person could cease to exist, how quietly it happened, how much it cost. "Thank you," she said. "Patricia, thank you." "Tell your husband," Patricia said, "that he has good taste in who he married." Emily called Noah. He picked up on the second ring. "It's done," she said, or nearly, on the second ring. "You're real, Noah. You're legally alive." The silence that came back to her was the fullest silence she had ever heard. Chapter 10. Finally Alive. On a Saturday morning in late April, a man drove a rental car south from Medford, Oregon, through the Cascade foothills and across the coastal range and down into the green corridor that ran toward the sea. He had driven this route once before, going the other direction, 5 years ago, when he was still learning to think of himself by a name that wasn't his own. That drive had been silent and cold and had tasted like loss. This one tasted different. Noah. Marcus. Noah. He was still sorting out what to call himself in his own head, which Patricia had told him was entirely normal and would resolve itself with time. Had called his mother on a Tuesday evening from his and Emily's kitchen, while Emily sat in the chair by the window, holding his hand and not looking at him, giving him the privacy of her presence. Holding his hand and not. The conversation had lasted 40 minutes. He didn't tell Emily everything that was said. She didn't ask. She understood that some things were between a man and his mother, and the 5 years that had passed between them like a wound. He told her his mother had cried. He told her his mother had also yelled at him for approximately 7 minutes straight, which he had told her was entirely fair. And he told her that his mother had said, when she finally stopped, "I knew. I don't know how I knew, but I knew you weren't gone." "Mothers," Emily had said. "Yeah," he said, and his voice had broken on the word in a way she had never heard from him before. His sister Claire drove down from Portland and met them in Harrow Cove 3 weeks later. She arrived in a small blue car, stepped out in front of the library, and stood on the sidewalk looking at her brother for a long moment, with an expression that contained 6 different feelings at once, for a long moment. Then she walked up to him and punched him in the shoulder. "You complete idiot," she said. "I know," he said. Then she hugged him. Claire was small, shorter than Emily, which was saying something, and she was gripping her brother like she was afraid he might evaporate. And Noah had his arms around her and his face turned away, and Emily stood a careful distance back and felt something in her chest rearrange itself permanently. She had given him back to his family, or they had given him back together. She was still figuring out the mathematics of it. His mother, Barbara, arrived with Claire that same day. She was 67, silver-haired, with the kind of quiet steadiness that explained a great deal about where Noah had come from. She shook Emily's hand on the library steps with both of hers and looked at her very directly. "He chose well," she said. "He kept some things from me," Emily said honestly. "He did," Barbara agreed. "He gets that from his father." "He did." They both had the same idea that protecting people meant not telling them things. She paused. They were both wrong, but they both meant well. Emily liked her immediately and completely. The small celebration that evening was held at the Anchor House, which was becoming the de facto location for the significant moments of Emily Carter's life. Mara was there, incandescent with the joy of having been right about Noah all along, and barely restraining herself from saying so. Gerald Marsh was there with a bottle of something he'd been saving for an occasion he couldn't previously name. Claire turned out to have a sardonic, rapid-fire sense of humor that made Emily feel like she had found a friend she hadn't known she was missing. Barbara sat next to Emily for most of the evening and told her stories about Marcus as a boy that made Emily understand him better than a year of conversation had. Noah sat at the head of the table. This man who had spent 5 years making himself invisible. And he was visible in a way she had never quite seen before. Not performing happiness. Not managing the room or the impression. Just there. Present. Real. After dinner, when the others had drifted into smaller conversations, he found her standing at the window that looked out over the harbor. The lighthouse at Harrow Point was doing its patient 30-second sweep. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He stood beside her. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the way she had learned to over the year, finding the exact angle that was most her and most him. "I know this isn't what you thought you were signing up for," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "I thought I was signing up for a quiet life with a carpenter." "I'm still a carpenter." "I know." She tilted her head up at him. "You're also Marcus Webb, as it turns out, and the son of a woman who knew you weren't dead. Marcus Webb, and the brother of someone who punched you in the shoulder and then cried for 20 minutes? 15 minutes? I counted." He smiled, the real one. "I'm sorry, Emily, for all of it, for what I kept from you, for the fear I put you through, for—" "Stop," she said, not harshly, just with finality. "You're going to apologize for the rest of your life if I let you. I don't want that." She turned to face him fully. "I want the rest of our lives to be something else. I want it to be forward." "Forward," he said. "You are legally alive. You are real. You exist." She put her hand against his chest, over his heart. "And you are mine, Noah Marcus Webb Reed, or whatever name we eventually settle on, and I would like to stop being married to a dead man and start being married to you." He brought his forehead down to rest against hers. "To you." Around them, the evening was gentle. The sound of Mara's laughter somewhere in the room, the clink of glasses, Barbara's voice asking Claire something about Portland, the lighthouse keeping its ancient, reliable time. "Marcus," he said quietly. "I think I want to be Marcus again, with Noah as a middle name." "Marcus Noah Webb," she said, testing it. "Yeah. That's a good name. I thought you might think so." She kissed him, simple and unhurried, the way you kiss someone you have not yet finished knowing. The way you kiss someone who is at the beginning of something, not the end. Outside, the harbor was quiet. The storm season was past. The water was the kind of silver gray that in Oregon means the sun is somewhere behind the clouds and the clouds are, for now, not going anywhere, but that the light is present regardless. You just have to know where to look, that the light is present. In the corner of the room, Gerald Marsh was saying something to Barbara Webb that made her laugh. A full, surprised laugh, younger than her age. Claire had her phone out, photographing her brother and his wife through the window. And in the photo, which Emily would not see for another 3 days, when Claire sent it to her with the caption, "Evidence that he's actually happy. Archive appropriately." They looked like exactly what they were. Two people who had found each other through a series of circumstances that no reasonable person would have predicted, who had survived something complicated and come out the other side still standing, still holding on, still choosing each other. Emily did not know, at that moment, which name she would use for him going forward in the small vocabulary of their private life together. Marcus felt like the person she was still meeting, life together. Noah was the one who had built her library back from storm damage, who had fixed her step without being asked, who had brought her a second cup of coffee on a Thursday morning when neither of them had acknowledged yet what they were becoming. She suspected she would use both. She suspected she would spend the rest of her life discovering that they were the same person. He pulled back from the kiss and looked at her with those serious, dark eyes that had been the first thing she noticed about him. And in them, she could see all of it. The years of carrying what he'd carried, the relief of having put it down, the particular joy of a person who had been found when they had given up expecting to be. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not letting me be dead." She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. "That is possibly the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know. I mean it anyway." She took his hand. "Come on, Marcus Noah Webb. I mean it anyway. Your mother is telling your sister embarrassing stories about you, and you should probably be there for it." He let her lead him back into the room, into the warmth and the light and the voices of the people who were, all of them, his family now. Hers and his, found and inherited and chosen. And the evening went on around them the way good evenings do, full of small, perfect moments that you can't quite hold on to and that you don't entirely need to, because they have already become part of you. The lighthouse swept its beam across the harbor. The water caught it and gave it back. In Harrow Cove, Oregon, on an April evening that smelled of salt and cedar and the very first warmth of spring, Marcus Noah Webb was alive. He had always been alive. Now, finally, everyone knew it. End of I Married a Man Who Was Legally Dead by Joan Savage,